Hi everybody, this is Gary Waite from Pegasus Battlefield Tours here in the UK, and you're listening to Your Papers Please podcast, the show that brings you some of the lesser known history of World War II. So, welcome to episode 5, where we're going to take a look at the evolution and administration of penicillin in World War II. Now, penicillin at the time was a brand new drug, and for the first part of the war was unavailable. However, by late 1943, it was being manufactured in greater quantities by the Allies, and therefore issued on a wider scale. Since its introduction in World War II, penicillin has formed the basis of our modern-day antibiotics and used to medicate a huge array of ailments. So what impact did penicillin actually have on World War II? Now, I may be a lot of things, but I am not a scientist. But just over a year ago, I met Professor Sarah Gurr, an extremely distinguished scientist, who is currently, along with an array of other senior posts, Chair of Food Security, based at Exeter University in the UK. She particularly specialises in the use of fungi. Sarah recently toured with me in Belgium and asked whether she could give a short talk on the use of penicillin and its use during the war. Of course, I said, and we aptly chose the site of a World War II medical post. I, along with the group of around 20, so enjoyed this talk that I asked Sarah to record it for me to share on this podcast. I will hand you over to Sarah.
So, did the discovery of penicillin and the ability to make penicillin impact on the outcome of World War II? I think the answer is yes. Hitler was desperate to get his hands on penicillin, for he and his Axis partners, that is Nazi Germany, the Kingdom of Italy and the Empire of Japan, could only produce relatively small amounts of penicillin, and certainly not enough to treat the soldiers, who were then reliant on the use of sulfonamides. However, Hitler himself was treated by penicillin, which we have to guess came from the Allies, when his failed assassination attempt was made in 1944, whereupon he was treated by his physician Theodor Morell. So intriguingly, it raises the possibility that penicillin from the Allied troops saved Hitler's life. However, on the other side of the story, the Allies were also unable to make penicillin in large quantities, and by 1944, 11,000 soldiers had been treated successfully with penicillin. But how did the story begin? So if you cast your mind back to the year 1928, Alexander Fleming, who was a bacteriologist working at St Mary's Medical School in London, was working on his favourite bacterium, a gram-positive strain called Staphylococcus aureus. One Friday night, he couldn't bring himself to clear away his glass agar plates which he used to inoculate his bacterium with. And returning to the lab on Monday, he noticed that there were zones of clearing around his bacterium, and he identified the contaminant as a fungus called Penicillium notatum. If you look down the microscope, Penicillium notatum, the structure of it looks like a little brush, and penicillus in Latin means little brush. But the question is, where did the spores come from? Some people say that they came from the brewery opposite, but more likely they came from downstairs where a chap called Charles Latouche was culturing fungi from damp Victorian basements, looking at health and poverty. So Fleming realized that the zone of clearing around his bacterium was due to something in the culture filtrate, something you could purify from growing the culture with the fungus. And he called it penicillin. And he published his findings in a journal from the Royal Society Journal in 1929. So fast forward now, with 10 years lapsing, until Oxford. And so now, with Howard Florey, who was Professor of Pathology in the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology, he was an Australian who'd come over having done a lot of work on mucus, but to lead the department in Oxford. He got into a collaboration with Ernest Chain, who was a Russian Jew and a German refugee, and he's a chemist who worked on lysozyme, and together they turned their attention towards penicillin. So Chain had surveyed the literature, and they obtained some funding from the Rockefeller Institute in America and a small amount from the Medical Research Council in England to work on penicillin. So Chain was to study the chemical structure, and Florey, with his assistant, the unsung hero Norman Heatley, to carry out biological experiments. The first problem, however, was how do you grow the fungus? And they started to grow it in what's known as solid-state fermentation, so on plates. They then moved to growing the fungus in biscuit tins and then in brass bedpans that they'd borrowed from the Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. They then turned to milk bottles, but the problem was they couldn't get enough surface area in the milk bottles for growing the fungus effectively. However, after 2 years' growth and extraction and back extraction, they obtained a small amount of penicillin, enough to put on a tiny glass watch glass. And in 1941, Chain gave 8 white mice lethal doses of the bacterium Streptococcus. 4 were given penicillin and 4 were not. And 24 hours later, returning from dinner at Lincoln College, they found 4 dead mice, and the 4 who'd received penicillin were alive, so they were jubilant. They applied for some more monies, but rather surprisingly, no British industry would give any interest to the large-scale production of penicillin. The MRC gave Florey the princely sum of £25 to investigate the properties of penicillin. Undaunted, the Works Department in the Pathology School in Oxford decided to design their own vessels, and Norman Heatley came up with a very flat system that you could inoculate through the neck with penicillin, and he commissioned 700 of these to be made in the potteries in Stoke-on-Trent, and this started the penicillin factory in Oxford. So Chain and a chap called Edward Abraham then improved the purification to boost the potency of penicillin by about 10-fold, and the first clinical trials were initiated by Charles Fletcher at Oxford's Radcliffe Infirmary, first to see if penicillin had any side effects on a woman dying from terminal breast cancer, and there were no side effects, and then on a 43-year-old policeman called Albert Alexander. This fellow had scratched his nose while pruning roses, so he had a trivial injury, but he was now dying of septicemia. And just 24 hours after a dose of penicillin, the policeman was sitting up in bed reading his newspaper. Unfortunately, the supply of penicillin ran out, and he died. So the next patient was cured, and then a 4-year-old boy was cured of cellulitis but sadly died of a brain hemorrhage. By 1941, it was obvious that larger clinical trials were needed, and so Florey and Heatley went off to get some monies from America. Heatley went to the Northern Regional Labs in Illinois, and Florey went to the pharmaceuticals companies. Florey found by chance a new strain of penicillium, now called Penicillium chrysogenum, which had been isolated from a melon, which gave greater quantities of penicillin. And he also found a new growth medium, which was a byproduct of the whiskey industry, corn steep liquor, and it was a cheap growth product from the maize industry. So what happened next? Pfizer became interested in this work, and being the main producers of citric acid, they decided to change their vessels to carry the fungus and to grow in large batch fermentations in liquid using these barrels or vessels. So they used 7,000-gallon tanks, and by 1944, as I've said, 11,000 patients had been treated, mostly soldiers in World War II. At last, Britain realised the significance of penicillin, and Glaxo, ICI, and Boots turned to producing antibiotics. In 1945, Abraham, Chain, and Florey received the Nobel Prize for this work. Sadly, not Norman Heatley, because the Nobel Prize can only be awarded to 3 people. And later on, in 1964, Dorothy Hodgkin also received a Nobel Prize for solving the structure of penicillin. Since then, a whole family of beta-lactam antibiotics has been discovered, including in the 1960s cephalosporin from the fungus Cephalosporium acremonium, a discovery made by a Sardinian microbiologist who'd been working in the sewers of Cairo. So today we are fortunate to have a whole spectrum of these beta-lactam antibiotics. But we shouldn't forget that if you go back to World War II, there was an intense fight in the production or in the desire to produce penicillin, and it's something that the Allied troops championed at.
Excellent, Sarah. It really hits home how important the production of penicillin actually was, something we all now take for granted. I certainly know that during World War I, somewhere in the region of 20% of casualties were due to infected wounds and gas gangrene, which of course is what penicillin helps to alleviate. Interesting too, that in World War II the Germans and Axis powers never pursued the pre-war work done at Oxford, which they definitely had access to. A fascinating story, so thank you again. That was Professor Sarah Gurr. Yes, thanks for listening to Your Papers Please with me, Gary Waite. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Please don't forget to subscribe so that you can be informed of all future releases. You can find me under Pegasus Battlefield Tours on Facebook and Twitter, and the website www.pegasusbattlefieldtours.com. Thanks everyone. Toodle pip.